Two little girls sit alone on the school steps, shivering, waiting, but no one's coming. Hours pass, no calls, no family, nothing. When the cop kneels beside them, they don't cry, they don't beg, they just whisper, "Today is our birthday." He's not supposed to get involved, but as the night unfolds, a shocking truth emerges, one that will change all of their lives forever. Who really abandoned them? And will this cop be the one to finally bring them home? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn wind whistled through the empty schoolyard as Officer Mark Reynolds trudged toward his patrol car. His shoulders ached from a long shift of paperwork and petty disputes. All he wanted was to get home, grab a cold beer, and forget about another frustrating day on the force. That's when he saw them. Two small figures huddled together on the concrete steps of Washington Elementary, their forms barely visible in the dim glow of the security light. The larger of the two had her arm wrapped protectively around the smaller one, both of them shivering in the chilly evening air. Mark's tired feet stopped in their tracks. He checked his watch, 8:45 p.m., way too late for kids to be at school. With a weary sigh, he changed direction and headed toward them. As he got closer, he could make out more details. The older girl looked about 10, with long, dark hair falling over her face like a shield. The younger one couldn't have been more than 7, clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest. Their clothes were clean but obviously well worn, the fabric thin and faded. "Everything okay here?" Mark asked, keeping his voice gentle despite his exhaustion. The older girl's head snapped up, her eyes sharp and wary. She pulled the younger one closer. "We're fine," she said firmly. "Our mom's coming." Mark noticed how the little one pressed closer to her sister, small fingers gripping the older girl's jacket. Something about their faces tugged at him, a familiar shape to their eyes, the curve of their cheeks. "I'm Officer Reynolds," he said, showing them his badge. "How long have you been waiting?" Before the older girl could answer, the school's janitor appeared behind them, keys jangling. "They've been here since dismissal," he said, concern etched on his weathered face. "That's almost 5 hours now. I've been checking on them, but—" He shrugged helplessly. Mark's jaw tightened. 5 hours in the cold. "What are your names?" he asked, crouching down to their level. The older girl hesitated, but the younger one spoke up, her voice small but clear. "I'm Liana Reynolds. This is my sister, Layla." Mark felt like someone had punched him in the gut. Reynolds. He stared at them, really looking now, and that nagging familiarity suddenly made terrible sense. They had Angela's nose, her delicate chin. Angela, the woman he'd dated briefly 11 years ago before she disappeared without a word. "Reynolds?" he managed to say, his throat dry. "Yeah," Layla said defiantly, as if daring him to make something of it. "What's it to you?" Mark's mind raced. He pulled out his phone, fingers clumsy as he accessed the school's emergency contact list. Every number listed for the girls was disconnected. His heart pounded as pieces started falling into place, pieces he wasn't sure he wanted to see. "Girls," he said carefully. "Where is your mother?" Layla's fierce expression wavered for just a moment. "She said she'd be here. She promised." Liana sniffled, hugging her teddy bear tighter. "She said that yesterday too," she whispered. Mark felt something crack in his chest, the protective wall he'd built around his heart developing its first real fissure. These girls, with their familiar features and his last name, shivering in the cold while waiting for someone who wasn't coming. His gut told him their mother wasn't just running late. The wind picked up and Liana trembled. Without thinking, Mark shrugged off his jacket and draped it over both girls. It swallowed them up, but at least it was warm. "When did you last see your mom?" he asked softly. Layla's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. 3 days ago. She said she was just going to the store." Her voice hardened. "But she's coming back. She always comes back." Mark knelt down on the cold concrete, his knees protesting as he tried to make himself less intimidating to the two girls. His police training had taught him how to handle all sorts of situations, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. facing two children who might be his own. "Listen," he said gently. "I know this is scary, but I need you to tell me more about your mom. Where do you live? Is there anyone else who takes care of you?" Layla's grip on her sister tightened, her knuckles white against Liana's worn jacket. Her eyes, so much like his own, remained fixed on some distant point over his shoulder. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of dead leaves skittering across the playground. Finally, Layla's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mommy said she'd come back." Her words carried the weight of someone who had said this many times before, like a prayer she desperately wanted to believe. Liana pressed herself closer to her sister, her small face buried in Layla's side. The teddy bear in her arms looked almost as worn down as the girls themselves. Mark pulled out his phone again, this time dialing the familiar number for Child Protective Services. The conversation was brief and frustrating. No immediate placement available. Earliest intervention would be tomorrow morning. The dispatcher's voice was apologetic but firm. They were stretched thin, especially at this hour. Running his hand through his hair, Mark considered his options. He could take them to the station, let them spend the night in the break room under the fluorescent lights and watchful eyes of the night shift. It was protocol, the safe choice, the by-the-book move he usually preferred. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way Layla's shoulders trembled despite her brave face. Maybe it was how Liana's fingers clutched at her sister's jacket, or how his own jacket draped around them both like a protective shield that was too little, too late. "Today is our birthday," Layla said softly, the words falling into the night air like stones into still water. Mark felt his chest tighten. Their birthday. Two little girls, abandoned on their birthday, waiting in the cold for a mother who wasn't coming back. The thought of them spending their birthday night in a sterile police station surrounded by strangers and harsh lights made something inside him rebel. He looked at them again, really looked. Their faces were tired, drawn with a weariness no child should know. His jacket hung like a tent around their small frames, and Liana's teddy bear had stuffing peeking out of one arm. They were trying so hard to be brave, to be strong, but they were just children. His children, if his gut feeling was right. Mark let out a long sigh, knowing he was about to break every protocol in the book. "All right, kids," he muttered, shaking his head at himself. "Just for tonight." The words felt heavy with meaning, like he was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. But as he watched Liana's eyes flicker with the first hint of hope and saw Layla's rigid posture soften just slightly, he knew he couldn't do anything else. Protocol would have to wait until morning. The small diner's neon sign cast a warm glow through the foggy windows as Mark ushered the girls inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the aroma of coffee and maple syrup wrapped around them like a warm blanket. At this late hour, the place was nearly empty save for a lone truck driver nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. "Pick any booth you'd like," Mark said, his voice gentler than usual. He watched as Layla guided Liana to a red vinyl booth near the window, both girls sliding onto the same side, still inseparable. A waitress with graying hair pulled into a messy bun approached their table, her name tag reading, Betty. Her tired expression softened when she saw the two girls huddled together, still wrapped in Mark's oversized police jacket. "What can I get for you folks?" Betty asked, pulling out her notepad. Mark glanced at the girls. "How about some birthday pancakes?" The words felt strange in his mouth, too soft for his usual gruff demeanor. Liana's eyes widened slightly, but Layla's face remained carefully neutral. "We don't need anything special," she said quietly. "Nonsense," Betty interjected warmly. "Birthday pancakes come with whipped cream faces and rainbow sprinkles. How special?" Mark ordered coffee for himself and hot chocolate for the girls. When Betty returned with their drinks, she'd added extra marshmallows to the girls' mugs. Liana stared at the floating white puffs with wonder, while Layla carefully wrapped her small hands around the warm ceramic. The pancakes arrived shortly after, golden brown and perfectly round, decorated with whipped cream smiles and sprinkle hair. Betty had even stuck a single candle in each stack, though she didn't light them. At first, the girls just stared at their plates. Layla took the smallest of bites as if testing whether the food was real. Liana followed her sister's lead, cutting off a tiny piece with her fork. But soon, the genuine warmth of the moment began to thaw their reserve. Liana giggled as she created a mustache of whipped cream on her upper lip. Even Layla's careful mask cracked, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth as she watched her sister's antics. Their laughter, soft at first, grew more confident, filling the quiet diner with a sound that made Mark's chest feel strangely tight. He found himself watching them, really watching them. The way Layla cut Liana's pancakes into smaller pieces without being asked. The way Liana's eyes crinkled when she smiled. The protective way Layla kept glancing at the door as if expecting their moment of happiness to be snatched away. "What's your best birthday memory?" Betty asked as she refilled Mark's coffee, her question innocent but loaded. Layla paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked around the diner, at the worn vinyl seats, the slightly sticky table, the tired waitress, and the police officer who had brought them here instead of following protocol. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she answered, "This one." Mark felt something sharp and unexpected pierce through his carefully maintained emotional armor. He quickly took a sip of his coffee, trying to wash away the lump forming in his throat. This was temporary, he reminded himself firmly. Just until morning, just until CPS could take over. But watching Liana carefully share a bite of her pancakes with her worn teddy bear, and seeing Layla's shoulders finally relax as she sipped her hot chocolate, Mark felt his usual coldness crack just a little. The girls' giggles echoed off the diner's worn tiles again, and for just a moment he allowed himself to forget about protocols and procedures. This was temporary, he thought again, but the words felt hollow even in his own mind as he watched the sisters share another conspiratorial smile over their birthday pancakes. While the girls focused on their pancakes, Mark's phone buzzed quietly against the worn diner table. He glanced at the screen. Lisa Carter, his partner. Before he could answer, Liana picked up a napkin from the dispenser and began folding it with careful concentration. "Want to make a paper airplane?" she asked softly, her small fingers creasing the thin paper. Mark hesitated, the phone still vibrating in his hand. Something in Liana's hopeful expression made him set the phone aside. "I used to make these all the time when I was your age," he found himself saying. Layla watched them carefully as Mark showed Liana how to fold the corners just right. His large hands, usually wrapped around a steering wheel or gripping his badge, now moved with surprising gentleness as he guided Liana's smaller ones. "Like this?" Liana asked, her face scrunched in concentration. "That's perfect," Mark said, helping her smooth down the final fold. "Now for the test flight." Liana's eyes sparkled as she launched the paper airplane. It glided gracefully across their booth, landing softly on the empty seat across from them. She clapped her hands quietly, and even Layla couldn't hide her small smile. The phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. Mark knew Lisa wouldn't call twice unless it was important. "I need to take this," he said, stepping away from the booth but keeping the girls in his sight. "Keep practicing those planes." "Reynolds," he answered, his voice low. Lisa's familiar voice came through, tight with concern. "Mark, I've been digging into their background. It's not good." Mark watched as Liana showed Layla how to fold her own airplane, the older sister's hands moving with the same careful precision she seemed to apply to everything. "Tell me." Their mother, Tamara Johnson, has a long history with narcotics. Multiple arrests, rehab attempts that never stuck. There are at least 3 previous CPS reports for neglect. Lisa paused, papers rustling in the background. "Mark, there's no father listed on either birth certificate." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. He watched Liana launch another airplane, her face lighting up as it soared across the booth. Layla caught it with careful hands, a rare smile touching her lips. "The last known address is a dead end," Lisa continued. "Neighbors say Tamara moved out weeks ago. No forwarding address." The fluorescent lights of the diner suddenly seemed harsh, casting sharp shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Mark could feel the weight of his badge against his chest, heavy with the responsibility of what came next. "There's more," Lisa said quietly. "The school records show they've been enrolled in 4 different districts in the past year alone. They've missed weeks of classes. Teachers have reported concerns about inadequate winter clothing, missed meals." Mark watched as Layla carefully divided her last pancake, giving the larger portion to Liana without hesitation. The younger girl's teddy bear sat propped against the window, its worn fur catching the neon light from outside. "What's the protocol here?" he asked, already knowing the answer, but hoping Lisa would offer something different. "You know what we have to do, Mark. CPS will place them in emergency foster care, probably separate homes given the short notice." "Separate?" Mark cut her off, his voice sharper than intended. He glanced quickly at the girls, but they were absorbed in their paper airplanes, this moment of peace still untouched by what was coming. "It's standard procedure when there's no immediate placement available for siblings," Lisa said gently. "Mark, I know that look in your voice. Remember, we're officers. We can't get personally involved." Mark watched as another paper airplane took flight, carrying with it the sound of Liana's quiet laughter and Layla's protective smile. His hand gripped the phone tighter as the weight of what came next settled heavily on his shoulders. The streetlights cast long shadows as Mark's police cruiser pulled up to the apartment complex. The building loomed dark and quiet, its brick facade weathered by years of neglect. In the back seat, Layla and Liana sat close together, their paper airplanes from the diner clutched tightly in their small hands. "This is it?" Mark asked, double-checking the address on his phone. The girls nodded silently. Something felt wrong. Mark's years of police work had given him a sixth sense for trouble, and right now, every instinct was on high alert. Most of the windows were dark, but apartment 2B, their apartment, had an eerie emptiness about it. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the night breeze. "Stay in the car," Mark instructed, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. But when he looked back, he saw Layla and Liana already climbing out, their faces tight with worry. "Mom always leaves the lights on," Layla whispered, her voice barely audible. "She says it keeps the bad dreams away." Mark's chest tightened at her words. He reached for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as they climbed the concrete stairs. Their footsteps echoed in the empty stairwell, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door creaked as Mark pushed it open, his flashlight sweeping across the apartment. The beam revealed bare walls where picture frames should have been. Empty hooks, nail holes, nothing else. "Mom?" Liana called out, her voice trembling. "Mommy?" The flashlight beam moved from room to room, revealing the same stark emptiness everywhere. No furniture, no clothes, no toys, just dust motes dancing in the light and the hollow sound of their footsteps on bare floors. In what must have been the girl's bedroom, Mark's light caught a single sheet of paper airplane folded from notebook paper, forgotten in a corner. Liana walked over and picked it up with shaking hands, her lower lip quivering. "I made this last week," she said, her voice small and broken. "Mom said she'd help me make more when she got back from the store." Layla stood in the center of the empty room, her usual protective stance crumbling as reality set in. Her hands were balled into tight fists at her sides, but Mark could see them trembling. "She wouldn't leave us, right?" Liana's voice cracked on the last word, her eyes wide and pleading as she looked between her sister and Mark. The question hung in the air like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. Mark watched as Layla tried to find words, to be strong for her sister like she always was, but this time, no words came. The paper airplane from the diner slipped from Liana's grasp, floating to the ground in a lazy spiral. The sound of it landing on the bare floor seemed to echo through the empty apartment, a final punctuation mark to their mother's abandonment. Mark knelt down beside Liana, his flashlight beam creating long shadows on the wall. He could see both girls fighting back tears, their small bodies rigid with the effort of holding themselves together. They were so young, yet they stood there with the quiet dignity of children who had learned too early that crying rarely changed anything. The empty apartment seemed to close in around them, each bare wall a reminder of promises broken, of birthday candles never lit, of bedtime stories never finished. The girls stood frozen in place, their shadows stretching long behind them as if trying to reach back to a time when their mother was still there. The empty apartment seemed to grow colder with each passing second. Mark's flashlight beam caught the dust particles floating in the air, making them look like falling snow in the darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft sounds of the girls breathing as they struggled to process what they were seeing. Mark had seen this before, too many times. Apartments stripped bare, children left behind, dreams shattered like broken glass. But something about these two little girls, standing so brave and small in their empty home on their birthday, made his throat tight with emotion. Layla's hand found his sleeve, her small fingers gripping the fabric with desperate strength. Her eyes, usually so guarded and protective, now showed raw fear. "Officer Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Is Mommy coming back?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Mark had delivered bad news countless times in his career, but this felt different. These weren't strangers. He'd watched them laugh over birthday pancakes just hours ago. He'd helped them fold paper airplanes. He'd seen their rare moments of joy. Slowly, carefully, Mark knelt down on the bare floor, bringing himself to their eye level. The flashlight cast shadows across their faces, highlighting the hope that still lingered there, hope he would have to extinguish. His knees cracked against the hard floor as he settled, but he barely noticed the discomfort. Looking at both girls, Layla with her protective stance now crumbling, and Liana clutching her sister's hand, Mark felt something shift inside his chest. These children deserved the truth, even if it hurt. They'd been lied to enough. "No, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "She's not." The words seemed to echo in the empty space. For a moment, time stood still. Then, like a dam breaking, both girls crumpled. Tears that had been held back for so long, through missed pickups, through empty promises, through lonely nights, finally burst free. Liana's sobs came first, deep and heart-wrenching, her small body shaking with the force of them. She pressed her face into her sister's shoulder, their paper airplanes from the diner falling forgotten to the floor. Layla tried to stay strong for one more moment, her chin quivering as she fought against the tears. But when Liana's arms wrapped around her, she broke too. Her carefully constructed walls came crashing down, and she cried with the raw anguish of a child who had tried to be an adult for far too long. Mark watched, feeling something inside him crack and splinter. In all his years on the force, he'd trained himself to maintain professional distance, to not let cases affect him personally. But watching these two little girls clutch each other as their world fell apart, something in his carefully constructed emotional armor began to crumble. Their sobs echoed off the bare walls, filling the empty apartment with the sound of their grief. They cried for their mother, for their lost home, for their birthday that had turned from joy to heartbreak. They cried for all the times they'd waited at school, for all the promises that had been broken, for all the love they desperately needed, but hadn't received. Mark's hands hung uselessly at his sides as he watched them cry, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't express. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly, casting wavering shadows on the wall behind them. In the harsh light, he could see every tear that rolled down their cheeks, every tremor that ran through their small bodies. These weren't just another case number now. These were two little girls whose world had just shattered, and somehow, watching them break down in this empty apartment, Mark felt something break inside him too. Mark stood outside his car, the engine now quiet in the empty parking lot of the abandoned apartment complex. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as he watched the two girls through the window. They had finally cried themselves to sleep, their faces still wet with tears, huddled together in the back seat like two lost birds seeking warmth. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he dialed Lisa's number. The late-night air was crisp, making his breath visible in small clouds as he waited for her to answer. "Mark?" Lisa's voice came through thick with concern. "How are they?" He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble of a long day's work. Asleep, finally. His voice was barely above a whisper, not wanting to wake them. "Lisa, their apartment's completely empty. Everything's gone." "I know," she sighed. "I've been making calls. CPS is swamped tonight. Some big case across town. They said it could be hours before they can process the girls." Mark's jaw tightened as he glanced back at the car. Liana had shifted in her sleep, her head resting on Layla's shoulder. Their birthday clothes were wrinkled now, and Layla still clutched the paper airplane from the diner even in sleep. Hours? He kept his voice low, but the frustration was clear. It's already past midnight. They can't just… I know, Mark, I know. Lisa's voice softened. Look, maybe you could… No. He cut her off, knowing what she was suggesting. I'm not equipped for this, Lisa. I don't even have… You have a spare room, she interrupted. And it's better than them spending the night in a police station or waiting for hours in some CPS office. Mark pressed his fingers against his temple, feeling a headache building. The logical part of his brain, the part that had kept him professional and distant for so many years, was screaming that this was a bad idea. But when he looked back at the car, at those two small figures curled up together, something else spoke louder. Layla stirred slightly in her sleep, instinctively pulling Liana closer. Even unconscious, she was still trying to protect her sister. The sight made Mark's chest tight with an unfamiliar feeling. Just one night, he muttered, more to himself than to Lisa. Until CPS can sort this out. Just one night, Lisa agreed, but there was something in her voice, a knowing tone that Mark chose to ignore. He ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket, taking a moment to collect himself before opening the driver's door. The car creaked softly as he settled into the seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. In the rearview mirror, he could see them clearly, two small faces peaceful in sleep, despite everything they'd been through. Liana's hand was still clutched in her sister's, their fingers intertwined as if afraid to let go. The sight made something in Mark's carefully constructed emotional walls crack just a little more. Just one night, he whispered again, starting the car. The engine hummed to life, and he carefully pulled away from the curb, driving as smoothly as possible to avoid waking them. As he navigated the quiet streets toward his apartment, Mark tried not to think about how unprepared he was for this. His place wasn't child-proof. He didn't have extra clothes or toys or whatever else kids needed. He was a bachelor cop who lived alone, who kept his emotions locked away, who followed protocol to the letter. But tonight, protocol would have to wait. Tonight, two little girls needed somewhere safe to sleep, and somehow, against all his better judgment, that somewhere was going to be his spare room. The streetlights cast alternating patterns of light and shadow across the sleeping faces in his back seat as he drove home, his mind racing with all the ways this could go wrong, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. Mark's apartment felt different with children in it. The stark white walls and minimal furniture that had never bothered him before now seemed to highlight just how empty his life was. No family photos adorned the walls. No cheerful artwork brightened the space. Just bare necessities arranged with military precision. He flicked on the lights, illuminating the living room where a single black couch faced a rarely used television. The girls stood close together in the doorway, their small shadows stretching across his spotless hardwood floor. Their eyes darted around, taking in the sterile environment with quiet uncertainty. "You can sleep here," Mark said, pulling a neatly folded blanket from the hall closet. The fabric still smelled like the store it came from. He'd never needed an extra blanket before. He spread it across the couch, trying to make it look inviting, but the girls didn't move. Liana's hand tightened around Layla's, and she looked up at her sister with worried eyes. Layla squeezed back, providing silent reassurance before turning to Mark. "We .. Liana's voice was barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard and tried again. "Can we stay in the same room?" Mark paused, looking between the two of them. Their faces were still puffy from crying earlier, and despite their obvious exhaustion, fear lingered in their eyes. The thought of separating them suddenly seemed cruel. He ran a hand through his short hair, considering his options. "I have a spare mattress," he said finally, the words coming out gruffer than he intended. "Give me a minute." The spare room was as bare as the rest of his apartment, just a place to store extra equipment and files. But there was enough space on the floor for the mattress he kept for emergencies. He dragged it out, surprised by how the girls immediately moved to help him, their small hands gripping the edges of the mattress. Together, they positioned it against the wall. Mark retrieved sheets from his linen closet, another set that had never been used, and watched as the girls worked together to make the bed, their movements suggesting they'd done this many times before. The sight made his chest tighten unexpectedly. How many times had these two little girls had to take care of themselves? "There's a bathroom down the hall," he said, clearing his throat, "and I'll be in the room next door if you need anything." The girls climbed onto the mattress, still fully dressed in their birthday clothes. They curled up together like they had in the car, Layla automatically wrapping a protective arm around her younger sister. Despite everything they'd been through, their mother's abandonment, the empty apartment, being taken to a stranger's home, they seemed to trust him implicitly. Mark moved to the doorway, his hand hovering over the light switch. The room was cold and bare, but the girls had somehow made it look warmer just by being there. He made a mental note to bring them an extra blanket, then immediately wondered why he was thinking about their comfort when they'd be gone tomorrow. "Good night," he said stiffly, flicking off the light. "Good night, Officer Mark," Layla's soft voice called out just as he was about to close the door. He froze, his hand gripping the doorknob. Something pulled at his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that made it hard to breathe for a moment. The words had been so simple, so innocent, yet they seemed to pierce right through the walls he'd built around himself. Mark stood there in the darkness, listening to their quiet breathing, feeling that strange tug in his chest grow stronger. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had wished him good night. The morning sun filtered through Mark's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the counter. He blinked slowly, his mind still fuzzy from a restless night filled with thoughts of the two girls sleeping in his spare room. Part of him expected to wake up and find it had all been a strange dream. The birthday pancakes, the empty apartment, the quiet good night that had somehow wormed its way past his defenses. But as he stepped into his kitchen, the sight before him proved it wasn't a dream at all. Liana stood on her tiptoes, carefully pushing bread into the toaster. Her small tongue poked out in concentration as she tried to line up the slice just right. Beside her, Layla stretched to reach the faucet, filling 2 plastic cups with water. Their movements were hesitant but determined, like they'd watched adults do these tasks 100 times but never quite learned how. Mark noticed how they both startled at his presence, their bodies tensing slightly. Liana's hand jerked, causing the bread to fall sideways in the toaster. She quickly tried to fix it, her fingers trembling. "What are you doing?" Mark asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. He immediately regretted his tone when he saw how both girls flinched. Layla set down the cups carefully, water sloshing over the sides. Her eyes darted between Mark and the floor, a familiar anxiety creeping into her expression. "We don't want to be a problem," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of someone who'd learned this lesson the hard way. Mark's stomach twisted painfully. These weren't just kids making breakfast. They were trying to prove their worth, to show they wouldn't be a burden. How many mornings had they woken up knowing they had to earn their keep? How many times had they been made to feel like their very presence was an inconvenience? He watched as Liana abandoned her toast-making attempt, moving closer to her sister like a magnet drawn to its pair. Their shoulders touched, a subtle gesture of support that spoke volumes about their shared experiences. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too stark. His pristine countertops and organized cabinets seemed to mock the chaos these girls had lived through. Their attempt at making breakfast, this simple, messy endeavor, was probably the bravest thing they'd done in a while. Mark's throat felt tight as he noticed other details. Their rumpled clothes from yesterday, their hair still mussed from sleep, the way they seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for his reaction. They looked so small standing there in his kitchen, trying so hard to be invisible while simultaneously proving they were useful. "You don't," Mark started, then cleared his throat when his voice came out hoarse. "You don't have to do this. You're not a problem." The girls exchanged a quick glance, the kind that suggested they'd heard similar words before, only to be disappointed later. Layla's hand found Liana's, their fingers intertwining in a practiced motion. "How about I make us all some proper breakfast?" Mark offered, trying to keep his voice gentle. "I think I might even have some eggs in the fridge." Neither girl moved at first, as if they weren't sure whether to believe him. Then Liana's stomach growled loudly, breaking the tension. A small giggle escaped her lips before she could stop it, and even Layla's serious expression cracked slightly. Mark felt something shift in his chest, that same strange pull he'd experienced the night before. These girls, with their careful movements and worried eyes, had somehow managed to make his cold kitchen feel more like a home in just a few minutes than he had in all the years he'd lived there. The police station buzzed with its usual morning activity, but Mark couldn't focus on any of it. His eyes kept drifting to the break room where Layla and Liana sat huddled together on a worn couch. Someone had given them coloring books and pencils, but they remained untouched on the table. Instead, the girls stayed close, their shoulders touching, watching everyone who passed by with wary eyes. Liana's head rested against Layla's shoulder, her small fingers playing with the hem of her sister's jacket. Every few minutes, Layla would whisper something to her, and Liana would nod slightly. They moved in perfect sync like two parts of the same heart. Mark stood in his office, one hand pressed against the window, watching them. He'd seen countless kids come through the station before. Lost ones, scared ones, troubled ones. But something about these two was different. Maybe it was the way they carried themselves, so small yet so strong. Or maybe it was how they'd tried to make breakfast that morning, desperate to prove their worth. The memory of their nervous faces in his kitchen made his chest tighten. He'd never noticed how cold his house was until he saw them standing there, trying to navigate his empty spaces. "You're staring again," Lisa's voice came from behind him. Mark straightened up, dropping his hand from the window. "Just keeping an eye on them," he muttered, turning to shuffle some papers on his desk. Lisa leaned against the doorframe, her eyes sharp and knowing. She'd been his partner long enough to read the tension in his shoulders, the way he couldn't quite meet her gaze. "I've got the preliminary report from CPS," she said, holding up a file. "But that's not what's interesting." "Lisa," Mark warned, recognizing the tone in her voice. "What's interesting," she continued, ignoring his protest, "is you. I've never seen you like this." Mark scoffed, but the sound felt hollow even to his own ears. "Like what?" "Different," Lisa said simply. She stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. "You're different, Mark. The way you look at them, the fact that you took them home instead of leaving them at the station." "It was late," he defended. "CPS wasn't available." "And the pancakes at the diner? The mattress on your floor?" Lisa raised an eyebrow. "That's not the Mark Reynolds I know." Mark turned back to the window, watching as a young officer offered the girls some water. Layla accepted the cups carefully, testing the weight before letting Liana take one. Even in this simple act, he could see how she protected her sister, how she checked everything first. "They were hungry," he said quietly. "It was their birthday." Lisa moved to stand beside him, her voice softening. "Exactly. The old Mark wouldn't have cared about that. The old Mark would have followed protocol to the letter. No exceptions." Mark wanted to argue, to brush off her observations like he usually did. But he couldn't deny the pull he felt every time Liana smiled or Layla whispered, "Officer Mark," in that cautious voice of hers. He couldn't ignore how his empty house had felt a little less empty with their presence. "They're just kids who need help," he said, but the words sounded weak even to him. "They're kids who need you," Lisa corrected gently. "And maybe you need them too." Mark's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. In the break room, Liana had finally picked up a coloring book. Her small hand gripped a blue pencil as she carefully filled in what looked like a butterfly. Layla watched her sister with a soft smile, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Something stirred in Mark's chest, warm and unfamiliar. He tried to brush it off, just like he tried to brush off Lisa's words, but deep down, in a place he usually kept locked tight, he knew she was right. He was different. These girls had somehow slipped past his defenses, and he wasn't sure he wanted to put them back up. Mark stood in the grocery store aisle staring at the rows of juice boxes. His hand hovered between apple and grape, a decision he'd never had to make before. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he found himself reading the labels, checking sugar content, wondering which would be better for growing kids. Kids. The thought made him pause. When had he started thinking about their needs? He grabbed both flavors and tossed them in his cart, already half filled with graham crackers, string cheese, and fruit cups. Things he'd never bought before. Things that had no place in his bachelor lifestyle of coffee and takeout. "It's temporary," he muttered to himself, ignoring the knowing look from an elderly woman passing by. "Just until CPS sorts everything out." But even as he said it, his eyes caught sight of dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets, and before he could stop himself, they were in the cart too. He remembered how Liana's eyes had lit up at the diner when she saw a dinosaur picture on the kids' menu. The checkout line felt like a confession booth. Each item that passed over the scanner seemed to mock his temporary argument. The cashier smiled warmly at his selections, probably assuming he was a regular dad doing regular dad shopping. The thought made his stomach twist. Back home, Mark found the girls exactly where he'd left them, Layla reading one of his old magazines to Liana on the couch. They looked up when he entered, their eyes widening at the sight of the grocery bags. "I got some snacks," he said gruffly, trying to sound casual as he unpacked the items. "You know, just basics." Liana bounced over to the counter, her small fingers reaching for a juice box. She looked at Mark first, waiting for permission. When he nodded, her whole face lit up. "Grape!" she exclaimed, hugging it to her chest. "Layla, look!" Layla approached more slowly, her observant eyes taking in everything. The variety of snacks, the careful selections, the way Mark had remembered to get both grape and apple juice. She helped him put things away, standing on her tiptoes to reach the cupboard shelves. Later that night, after dinosaur nuggets and apple juice, after teeth were brushed and pajamas were changed, Mark had found their small backpack in the car containing only a few clothes. The girls settled onto their mattress on the floor of his spare room. Mark sat on the edge, awkwardly attempting his version of a bedtime routine. He'd never tucked anyone in before, but he found himself pulling the blanket up to their chins, making sure they were warm enough. Layla watched him with those knowing eyes of hers looking far older than her years. She seemed to be studying him, trying to figure something out. Finally, in the soft glow of the nightlight he'd bought, another temporary purchase, she spoke. "Do you have kids, Officer Mark?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. Images flashed through his mind, a younger version of himself. A girlfriend who'd left town suddenly, unanswered calls that eventually stopped. He'd buried those memories deep, locked them away where they couldn't hurt anymore. He cleared his throat, pushing the thoughts aside. "No," he replied gruffly, adjusting the blanket one more time. "Just you two for now." The words "for now" hung in the air between them. Layla nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. Beside her, Liana had already drifted off to sleep, clutching the stuffed dinosaur that had somehow made its way into his shopping cart. Mark stood up, his movements stiff and uncertain. The domesticity of the moment felt foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. Yet somehow, it didn't feel wrong. "Good night, Officer Mark," Layla whispered, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "Good night, kids," he replied softly, pausing at the door to watch them for a moment longer. Lisa's voice was low as she spoke into the phone, but Mark could still hear every word from his desk. His eyes kept drifting to the girls sitting in the break room, sharing a package of cookies someone had left out. Layla carefully broke each cookie in half, making sure Liana got the bigger piece every time. "Yes, I understand," Lisa said into the receiver, her forehead creasing. "And you're certain about this?" She scribbled something on her notepad, her pen moving quickly across the paper. Mark watched as Liana drew pictures on a spare piece of paper, her small legs swinging beneath the chair. Layla sat protectively close, as always, but there was something different about her posture now. She seemed more relaxed, less like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Lisa hung up the phone and walked over to Mark's desk, her expression troubled. "That was CPS," she said, keeping her voice down. "They think they found a lead on Tamara Johnson." Mark's stomach tightened. "And she's crossed state lines. Arizona, they think, but..." Lisa shook her head. "The trail's already cold. She's using cash, staying off the grid. They don't expect to locate her anytime soon." Mark looked back at the girls. Liana was now showing her drawing to Layla. It appeared to be stick figures standing in front of what might have been his house. His chest felt heavy. "They're settling in," Lisa observed softly. following his gaze. "I see how they look at you now, Mark. Like they're waiting for permission instead of waiting to run." "Don't," Mark warned, but his voice lacked its usual edge. "They trust you," Lisa continued. "When was the last time anyone trusted you like that?" Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the truth was, he couldn't remember anyone ever looking at him the way these girls did. Like he could fix anything, make everything okay. The drive home that evening was quiet. Streetlights cast long shadows across the dashboard as Mark navigated the familiar route. In the rearview mirror, he could see Layla fighting sleep, her head bobbing slightly before jerking back up. Liana had already lost the battle, curled up against her sister's shoulder. The radio played softly, some old song about home and belonging that made Mark's throat feel tight. He reached to turn it off, but Layla's sleepy voice stopped him. "I like this song," she murmured. Mark left it on. Traffic lights changed from red to green, casting different colored glows across their faces. At each stop, Mark found himself checking the mirror, making sure they were still there, still safe. It was becoming a habit he didn't want to examine too closely. They were almost home when Liana stirred slightly. Her eyes fluttered half open, and in that space between sleep and waking, she mumbled something that made Mark's hands tighten on the steering wheel. "I like being here." 3 simple words, but they hit Mark like a physical force. He glanced in the mirror again, saw Liana already drifting back to sleep, her face peaceful. Beside her, Layla watched him with those knowing eyes of hers as if waiting to see what he would do with her sister's confession. Mark swallowed hard, his knuckles white against the black leather of the steering wheel. The word temporary felt hollow now, a lie he'd been telling himself. These girls, with their half-shared cookies and careful trust, had somehow worked their way past his defenses when he wasn't looking. The rest of the drive passed in silence, but Mark's mind was anything but quiet. Each street they turned down brought them closer to home. Not just his house anymore, but home. When had that happened? When had he started thinking of it that way? The changes happened so gradually that Mark barely noticed them at first. The grocery cart filled with items he'd never bought before. Fruit cups, chocolate milk, and those little cheese crackers Liana loved. His usual quick grab of coffee and frozen dinners expanded into actual meals, things that would fill 2 small stomachs. The thermostat, which he'd always kept at a stern 65 degrees to save money, now hummed steadily through the night. He'd noticed Liana shivering that first evening, her small frame curled tight beneath a thin blanket, and something in him couldn't bear to see it again. His Spartan house began sprouting signs of life. Soft blankets appeared on the couch, carefully folded each morning. A nightlight glowed in the hallway. 2 small toothbrushes stood in a cup by the bathroom sink. The refrigerator door, once pristinely clean, now held a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures, Liana's artwork. Mark found himself doing things without thinking. He'd pick up extra paper towels when he saw they were running low, or grab another box of cereal before the current one was finished. Small things, ordinary things, but each one felt like another brick in a wall he hadn't meant to build. One particularly hectic morning, as Mark rushed to get ready for an early shift, he caught sight of Layla in the living room. She stood by the couch, methodically folding the blankets they'd used the night before. Her small hands moved with practiced precision, smoothing each wrinkle as if the perfect fold might somehow earn her the right to stay. Mark stopped in the doorway, his coffee forgotten in his hand. The sight hit him harder than he expected. This little girl, trying so hard to be invisible, to be good, to not give anyone a reason to send her away. He recognized that careful attention to detail, the desperate need to prove your worth. He'd been that child once. Layla noticed him watching and froze, her hands still clutching the blanket. Her eyes darted to his face, then away, then back again, checking for signs of disapproval. The morning sun streaming through the window caught the uncertainty in her expression, the way she held herself ready to apologize for whatever she might have done wrong. Mark knew he should say something about this being temporary. He should remind her not to get too comfortable, that this wasn't meant to be permanent. The words sat heavy on his tongue. "You know this isn't forever." But looking at her there, This child who had already heard too many goodbyes, he couldn't bring himself to say them. Instead, he cleared his throat and said softly, "You don't have to do that." Layla's hands tightened on the blanket. "I want to help," she whispered, her voice small but determined. So we're not." "A burden?" Mark finished, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. Layla nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. From the kitchen came the sound of Liana humming as she ate her breakfast, completely unaware of the weight of this moment. The familiar tune, something from a cartoon they'd watched together, filled the quiet space between Mark and Layla. Mark set his coffee down and moved closer, kneeling to meet Layla's eye level. "Listen," he said, his voice gentler than he'd ever heard it. "You don't have to earn your place here. Either of you. Okay?" The blanket trembled slightly in Layla's hands, but she didn't answer. Mark reached out slowly and took it from her, letting it fall unfolded onto the couch. "Let's get some breakfast," he said. "The blanket can wait." The morning sun cast long shadows across Mark's kitchen as he helped Liana tie her shoelaces. School supplies were scattered across the table, fresh notebooks, pencils, and 2 identical backpacks he'd bought the night before. Everything was new. Everything matched. He wanted to do this right. But what if... Layla's voice trailed off as she clutched her backpack straps. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Mark knew what she was thinking. "Your mom won't come back," he said gently, meeting her worried eyes. "And if she did, she'd check with the school first. They have my number now." Liana looked up from her shoes, her lower lip trembling slightly. "Promise?" Mark's heart clenched at the word. These girls had heard too many broken promises already. "I promise," he said firmly. "I'll be right here when school ends. Right in this spot." The drive to school was quiet. Mark caught glimpses of the girls in his rearview mirror, Layla staring out the window, her face set in careful concentration, while Liana fidgeted with her new pencil case. They looked so small in their fresh clothes, carrying backpacks that seemed too big for their shoulders. As they pulled into the school parking lot, the morning drop-off was in full swing. Parents hugged their children goodbye, kids ran to meet their friends, and teachers greeted everyone with bright smiles. It was a normal scene, one that played out at schools everywhere, but today it felt different to Mark. He watched as a father kissed his daughter's forehead before sending her off to class. A mother straightened her son's collar, fussing over his hair. Simple gestures, everyday moments of love that Layla and Liana had missed out on for so long. The girls climbed out of the car slowly, holding hands as they always did. Their new teacher, Mrs. Bennett, waited at the entrance with a warm smile, but they didn't rush forward like the other children. Instead, they stood close to Mark, neither moving toward the school nor back to the car. "Officer Mark?" Liana's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if the other kids ask about our mom?" Mark knelt down, ignoring the dampness of the morning dew seeping into his uniform pants. "You don't have to tell them anything you don't want to," he said. "Just say you're staying with me for now." Layla's grip on her sister's hand tightened. "But what are you? To us?" The question caught Mark off guard. What was he to them? Their temporary guardian? A cop who took pity on them? The words felt hollow and wrong. Before he could answer, a group of children ran past, their laughter echoing across the playground. One little girl waved to her dad, calling out, "Love you, Daddy." The man waved back, his face glowing with natural, unconditional love. Mark felt something shift inside him as he watched Layla and Liana follow the scene with hungry eyes. These girls deserved that kind of love. Simple, unconditional, freely given. They deserved someone who would wave goodbye every morning and be there every afternoon. Someone who would never make them question their worth or their place in the world. Mark started, then cleared his throat. "I'm someone who cares about you. Someone who will be here. Every day." Liana's face softened slightly, but Layla's eyes remained cautious, searching his face for any sign of deception. She'd learned too young to look for lies in adult promises. "Right here?" Liana asked, pointing to the spot where they stood. "Right here," Mark confirmed, his voice stronger now. Same spot every day. You can count on it. The kitchen was filled with the smell of spaghetti sauce as Mark stirred the pot, trying to remember his mother's old recipe. He'd never been much of a cook. Takeout and microwave meals had been his go-to for years. But now, watching Layla and Liana set the table with careful precision, he found himself wanting to do better. "Is it supposed to be this thick?" he muttered to himself, adding a splash of water to the sauce. Layla approached the stove, standing on her tiptoes to peer into the pot. "My friend Jessica's mom always adds butter," she offered quietly, then quickly added, "But this looks good too." Mark grabbed the butter from the fridge, grateful for the tip. As he dropped a pat into the sauce, Liana settled into one of the kitchen chairs, swinging her legs back and forth. "Do you have a family, Officer Mark?" The question came suddenly, making Mark's hand freeze mid-stir. He shrugged, keeping his eyes on the pot. "Not really, just me." "But you must have had a mom and dad," Liana pressed, her voice curious and innocent. "Where are they?" Mark's jaw tightened slightly. He could feel both girls watching him now, waiting. The sauce bubbled, filling the awkward silence. "They're gone," he said finally, his voice gruff. "Have been for a while." Layla stood very still beside him, her small fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve. "No brothers or sisters?" "Nope." Mark stirred the sauce with more force than necessary, watching the butter swirl into golden streaks. The kitchen grew quiet except for the soft bubbling of the sauce and the gentle ticking of the wall clock. Mark could feel the weight of unasked questions hanging in the air. He'd gotten used to the girls' presence in his house, their quiet footsteps in the hallway, their whispered conversations at night. But these questions about family and belonging, made his chest feel tight. Layla shifted beside him, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "You can't be our dad, right?" The wooden spoon clattered against the pot as Mark's hand jerked in surprise. His throat tightened as he looked down at Layla's face, so serious, so cautious, yet unable to hide the hint of hope in her eyes. He forced a chuckle, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I'm just looking out for you," he said, turning back to the stove. "That's all." Layla lowered her gaze to the floor, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Yeah," she said softly. "That's what all the grown-ups say before they leave." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He stared at the sauce, watching it bubble and pop, but not really seeing it. Each breath felt heavier than the last as memories of his own childhood flashed through his mind. Empty promises, packed bags, closed doors. Liana's chair scraped against the floor as she stood up. "But you're different," she said, her voice small but certain. "You make us breakfast, and you bought us matching backpacks, and you're making real dinner." Mark gripped the edge of the stove, his knuckles turning white. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm, too small, too full of things he wasn't ready to face. He could feel Layla's eyes on him, measuring his reaction, waiting for the confirmation of her fears. Liana stood hopefully between them, her faith in him both beautiful and terrifying. The sauce began to bubble over, spilling onto the stovetop with a sharp sizzling sound. Mark quickly turned down the heat, grateful for the distraction. His hands moved automatically, stirring the sauce, checking the pasta, doing anything to avoid the weight of the moment. Lisa's hands trembled as she stared at the DNA results on her computer screen. The numbers and percentages blurred together, but one fact remained crystal clear. Mark Reynolds was a perfect paternal match for both Layla and Liana. Her coffee grew cold beside her as she read the file again and again, trying to make sense of it all. The office around her buzzed with the usual morning activity, but Lisa felt like she was underwater, everything muffled and distant. She clicked through the girls' birth records, piecing together a story that had been hidden for years. Their mother, Tamara Johnson, had never listed a father on the birth certificates, but the DNA didn't lie. "This can't be," Lisa muttered, running her fingers through her hair. She remembered Mark from 8 years ago, younger, even more closed off than now. There had been a time when he'd disappeared for a few weeks, coming back different, harder somehow. He'd never talked about it, and she'd never pushed. The CPS representative, Mrs. Chen, leaned over Lisa's desk, double-checking the results. "The match is definitive," she confirmed, her voice steady. Officer Reynolds is their biological father. Given the circumstances, this changes everything about their case. Lisa's mind raced through the past few weeks. Mark taking the girls in, his gradual softening around them, the way they seemed to naturally fit into his life. Had some part of him known? Had there been some invisible pull of blood calling to blood? Her hand shook as she reached for her phone. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Mark needed to know. He deserved to know. But how do you tell someone they've been a father for 8 years without knowing it? Lisa dialed Mark's number, her heart pounding with each ring. When he answered with his usual gruff, "Reynolds here," she had to take a deep breath to steady herself. Mark ... Her voice quivered despite her best efforts to keep it professional. "I need to see you, now." "Lisa? What's wrong?" She could hear the immediate shift in his tone, the way he picked up on her distress. "Just come to my office, please." Lisa glanced at Mrs. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. "It's about the girls." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of keys jingling. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." Lisa hung up and stared at the file in front of her. 8 years. Those girls had been without their father for 8 years because of paperwork and secrets and circumstances. She thought about Layla's protective nature, Liana's shy smiles, the way they both watched Mark when they thought he wasn't looking. Mrs. Chen gathered her papers, preparing to leave. "Would you like me to be here when you tell him?" Lisa shook her head. "No, I should do this alone. He'll need space to process this." The CPS representative nodded understanding and quietly left the office. Lisa stood up, pacing the small space between her desk and the window. Outside, the morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Somewhere out there, Mark was driving toward a truth that would change his life forever. She thought about all the times she'd teased him about being a robot, about his inability to connect with people. Yet somehow, those 2 little girls had cracked his armor without even trying. Maybe this wasn't just coincidence, maybe this was how things were supposed to be all along. Lisa heard Mark's heavy footsteps in the hallway and took one final deep breath. She clutched the file to her chest, watching as her partner of 6 years pushed open her office door, his face etched with concern. "What's going on?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "Are the girls okay?" Lisa's throat tightened. "Mark," she said softly, "you need to sit down for this." Lisa sat in the corner booth of Joe's Diner, her fingers drumming nervously against the worn Formica table. The lunch crowd had thinned out, leaving only a few regulars scattered around the restaurant. The gentle clink of coffee cups and distant kitchen sounds filled the heavy air. She watched through the streaked window as Mark's police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. Her heart hammered against her ribs as he stepped out, his face set in its usual stern expression. The manila folder on the table seemed to burn under her fingertips. The bell above the door chimed as Mark entered. His boots squeaked against the checkered floor as he made his way to her booth. Lisa noticed the dark circles under his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights spent caring for 2 little girls he didn't know were his own. "This better be important," Mark said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I left the girls with Johnson at the front desk." Lisa took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Mark, what I'm about to show you, it's going to change everything." Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic. She slid the file across the table, watching as Mark's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the documents inside. Lisa saw the exact moment realization hit him. His face went pale, his hands began to tremble ever so slightly. This can't be right," he whispered. But his eyes kept moving across the page, taking in every detail. His jaw clenched and unclenched as he read his own name listed as the biological father. Lisa watched as different emotions flickered across his usually stoic face. Shock, disbelief, anger, and something deeper, more vulnerable. She saw him close his eyes briefly and knew he was remembering. When they opened again, they were filled with a pain she'd never seen before. "Tamara," he said, his voice rough. 8 years ago. It was just a few weeks and then she disappeared. His fingers traced the DNA results unconsciously. I never knew. She never told me. Mark, Lisa said softly, reaching across the table but stopping short of touching his hand. The girls, they're yours. They've always been yours. He looked up at her, his face stripped of its usual armor. They're mine? The question came out barely above a whisper, filled with wonder and fear, and 8 years of lost time. Lisa nodded solemnly. They've always been yours, Mark, you just didn't know. Mark's hands shook as he closed the file. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he sat there, processing the truth. His children. Layla and Liana were his children. All those nights he'd spent watching them sleep, all those mornings making them breakfast, all those moments when something about their faces seemed hauntingly familiar. It all made sense now. All this time, he said, his voice cracking slightly. All this time, they were right there, and I never knew. Their birthday, their first steps, their first words. His fingers curled into fists on the table. I missed everything. Lisa leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. You didn't know, Mark. You couldn't have known. But you're here now, and those girls? They already trust you. They already look up to you. Maybe that's not a coincidence. Mark stared down at the closed file, his world tilting on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his life, about those 2 little girls who had somehow worked their way into his carefully ordered existence. It was all different now. He was a father. He had always been their father. The drive home felt surreal to Mark. Every streetlight, every turn, every familiar landmark seemed different now, as if the world had shifted on its axis. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, but he barely noticed. His mind kept circling back to that manila folder, to those test results that had changed everything. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the modest house he'd never really thought of as a home, until 2 little girls had filled it with their presence. Through the living room window, he could see the soft glow of the lamp he'd started leaving on at night. For them, he realized. He'd been doing so many things for them without even knowing they were his. Inside, the house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the heater. Mark moved silently through the darkness, his footsteps careful and measured as he made his way to the living room. There they were, Layla and Liana, curled up together on the pull-out couch like always. The sight of them hit him differently now, knowing what he knew. He stood there watching them sleep, seeing them with new eyes. Layla's determined little frown, even in sleep, that was his frown. Liana's slightly upturned nose. He'd seen that same nose in childhood photos of himself. How had he not noticed before? The signs had been there all along, written in their faces, in their mannerisms, in the way they both got that same stubborn set to their jaw when they were trying not to cry. Layla's words from earlier echoed in his head. You can't be our dad, right? The memory made his chest ache. She'd asked the question expecting rejection, because rejection was all these girls had ever known. His daughters had spent 8 years without him, thinking they weren't wanted, while he'd been completely unaware of their existence. Mark's fists clenched at his sides as doubt crept in. What did he know about being a father? He could barely keep his own life together some days. His house was sparse, his schedule unpredictable, his emotional walls sky-high. These girls deserved better than a closed-off cop who didn't know the first thing about raising children. Maybe they would be better off with someone else, someone who knew what they were doing, someone who could give them everything they needed, everything they deserved, someone who wasn't broken and distant and, don't go. The soft, sleep-mumbled words froze Mark in his tracks. Liana had shifted in her sleep, one small hand reaching out into the empty air. His heart clenched painfully in his chest as he watched her fingers curl around nothing, searching for comfort even in sleep. Something broke inside Mark then, something he'd kept locked away for years. These girls, his girls, had spent their whole lives reaching out into empty air, looking for someone who wasn't there. And now here he was, thinking about walking away just like everyone else had. He couldn't do it. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He couldn't leave them. He never could have, even before he knew the truth. From that first moment, he'd seen them sitting alone on those school steps. Something in him had recognized them, had known they belonged with him. Mark moved closer to the couch, his footsteps silent on the carpet. Carefully, so carefully, he reached down and tucked the blanket more securely around their shoulders. Liana's searching hand found the edge of his sleeve, and her fingers curled into the fabric with surprising strength. The simple gesture of trust made his throat tight with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered more to himself than to them. "I promise." The next few days passed in a blur for Mark. On the surface, everything looked normal. He still made breakfast, drove the girls to school, went to work, picked them up, helped with homework. But inside, his mind was a storm of emotions he couldn't quite process. He found himself studying them constantly, noticing little things he'd missed before. At breakfast, Layla would always carefully divide the food, making sure Liana got the bigger portion of eggs, the crispier piece of toast. She'd wait until her sister started eating before touching her own plate, a habit born from years of making sure her little sister never went hungry. During their walks to the car, Liana would instinctively reach for his hand when they approached the street. Her small fingers would wrap around his with complete trust, and each time it happened, Mark felt his heart constrict. These simple gestures of faith from his daughter, left him breathless with a mixture of joy and terror. He noticed how they both had his habit of furrowing their brows when concentrating, how Layla's determined expression matched his own when she tackled her math homework, how Liana hummed softly while drawing, just like he did when filing paperwork, a habit his mother used to tease him about. Every new discovery felt like a gift and a burden all at once. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe sometimes. These girls had already been failed by one parent. What if he failed them too? One evening after tucking the girls into bed, Mark sat in his darkened kitchen, staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over Lisa's number for a long moment before he finally pressed call. "Mark?" Lisa's voice was soft with concern. "Everything okay?" He rubbed his face with his free hand, feeling the roughness of stubble against his palm. "I don't know how to tell them, Lisa. Every time I try, the words just stick." "What's really bothering you, Mark?" He closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. "What if I'm not good enough?" The words came out barely above a whisper. These girls have been through so much already. They deserve better than... He gestured helplessly at his sparse kitchen, at himself even though Lisa couldn't see it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Lisa spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "Mark, do you remember last week when Liana had that nightmare? You sat with her for hours just holding her hand and telling her stories until she felt safe enough to sleep again." Mark swallowed hard at the memory. "That's different, that's just..." "And yesterday when Layla was struggling with her science project? You didn't just help her finish it. You taught her how to do it herself, made her feel capable and smart. Lisa, you were never meant to be just their protector, Mark. You were meant to be their father." Lisa's words hit him like a physical force. "And you already are, whether you realize it or not. Those girls look at you like you hung the moon, and it's not because you're perfect, it's because you're there. You show up. You care. That's what being a father is." Mark stared out his kitchen window at the dark sky, his throat tight with emotion. From down the hall, he could hear the soft sounds of his daughters sleeping, Liana's quiet snores, Layla's occasional murmur. The familiar sounds wrapped around his heart like a warm blanket. "I'm scared," he admitted finally, his voice rough. "Good," Lisa replied. "That means you understand how important this is. But Mark, being scared doesn't mean you're not ready. It just means you care enough to want to get it right." The weekend fair transformed the usually quiet park into a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds. Mark watched as Layla and Liana's eyes grew wide at the sight of the towering Ferris wheel, the spinning carousel and the countless game booths lined with stuffed animals bigger than they were. "Can we really go anywhere?" Liana asked, bouncing on her toes, her small hand clutching a blue balloon that matched her sweater. Mark nodded, trying to hide his own smile at their excitement. "Anywhere you want, within reason." The girls exchanged looks of pure joy before Layla, usually so reserved, grabbed her sister's hand and pointed toward a cotton candy vendor. "Look, Liana! The pink clouds." Mark bought them each a stick of cotton candy, watching in amusement as they tried to figure out how to eat the fluffy treat. Liana dove right in, ending up with pink sugar all over her cheeks, while Layla carefully pulled off small pieces, making sure none went to waste. The fair buzzed with life around them, children laughing, carnival music playing, the mechanical whir of rides mixing with the excited shouts from game booths. Mark found himself relaxing despite his inner turmoil, caught up in the simple pleasure of watching the twins experience everything for the first time. They wandered through the fair, stopping at every attraction that caught their eye. Liana insisted on riding the carousel 3 times, waving from her painted horse each time she passed by. Layla, more practical, spent time studying the ring toss game before attempting it, her face scrunched in concentration. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fairground as they made their way through the crowd. The girls ran a few steps ahead, their balloons bobbing above them like colorful beacons, their earlier shyness forgotten in the excitement of the day. That's when it happened. A large man busy talking on his phone barreled through the crowd without looking. He knocked right into Liana, sending her stumbling backward. Before Mark could even react, Layla was there. She moved like lightning, positioning herself between her sister and the stranger, her small body tense and ready. Her eyes, usually soft, turned sharp and watchful, a look Mark knew all too well from his own childhood. The man muttered a distracted apology and moved on, but Mark stood frozen, watching Layla. She hadn't moved from her protective stance, one arm still held out in front of her sister. It was a gesture he'd seen countless times in his years as a cop, parents shielding their children from danger. But seeing it in Layla, this little girl who was so much like him, hit differently. "You okay, kid?" he asked softly, kneeling down to their level. Layla nodded, but Mark saw it, that flicker of fear in her eyes, the way she was still scanning the crowd for threats. It was the same look he'd worn as a child, always watching, always ready to protect himself from the next disappointment, the next person who might hurt him. In that moment, looking at Layla's protective stance and Liana's complete trust in her sister, Mark felt something shift inside him. These weren't just 2 lost girls he was temporarily housing. They were his daughters, carrying pieces of him in their very souls. His protective instincts, his watchful nature, his deep capacity for love hidden beneath layers of caution. He couldn't keep running from this truth, couldn't keep pretending this was temporary. These girls were his in every way that mattered, and they needed more than just a protector. They needed a father who understood their fears because he'd lived them too. The night wrapped Mark's house in a gentle silence, broken only by his hushed voice as he paced in the kitchen. The overhead light cast long shadows across the floor while he talked to Lisa on the phone, running his free hand through his hair. "I know the custody filing is complicated, Lisa," he whispered, glancing toward the hallway where the girls slept. "But they're my daughters. I have to do this right." Lisa's voice crackled through the speaker. "The paperwork is almost ready. We just need to make sure everything's in order before we submit it to the court." Neither of them noticed the small figure that appeared in the kitchen doorway. Layla stood frozen, her empty water glass clutched tightly in her trembling hands. She'd only wanted a drink of water, but now her whole world was crumbling around her. "What if the judge doesn't approve?" Mark asked, his back turned to the doorway. "What if they think I'm not qualified? I mean, I'm a single cop with irregular hours." Layla's heart plummeted to her stomach. The glass nearly slipped from her fingers as tears welled up in her eyes. She didn't wait to hear more. Setting the glass down silently on the nearest surface, she turned and ran back to the bedroom on tiptoes, just like she'd learned to do in all the other homes. The bedroom was dark except for the small nightlight plugged into the wall. Liana lay curled up under her blanket, peaceful and unaware. Layla rushed to her sister's side, shaking her shoulder urgently. "Liana, wake up," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We have to go." Liana stirred slowly, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" "Officer Mark doesn't want us," Layla said, the words burning in her throat. She could barely get them out. "I heard him on the phone. He doesn't think he can keep us." Liana pushed herself up on her elbows, her hair messy from sleep. "That's not true," she mumbled, still half asleep. "He makes us breakfast. He bought us new clothes." But Layla was already pulling their backpack from under the bed, the one they'd kept packed since their mother first started disappearing for days at a time. Her hands shook as she checked its contents. A change of clothes, their mother's old photo, the few small treasures they'd managed to keep through all their moves. "You don't understand," Layla whispered fiercely, trying to keep her voice from breaking. "They're going to send us away. There's going to be a judge and everything." She could feel her walls building back up, the same walls that had protected her through every disappointment, every abandoned promise, every adult who'd said they cared and then disappeared. She'd been stupid to let them down, stupid to think Officer Mark was different. Liana sat up fully now, her lower lip trembling. But he's nice to us. He helps me with homework." "That's what they all do at first," Layla said, zipping up the backpack. Her voice sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "They pretend they care, and then they decide we're too much trouble." In the kitchen, Mark's voice continued its low murmur, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding in the girls' room. Layla could still hear him talking about courts and judges and qualifications, all the grown-up words that always meant goodbye. She sat on the edge of the bed, the backpack heavy in her lap. Her chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing all the air out of her lungs. She'd let herself believe in this home, in Officer Mark's quiet kindness, in the way he always made sure they had warm blankets and enough food. She'd started to think maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But now she knew better. She was 12 years old and she should have known. Good things didn't last, not for girls like her and Liana. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow that should have made everything feel cozy and safe. But something was different. Mark noticed it the moment he stepped into the kitchen, still adjusting his police uniform. Layla sat at the table, pushing her cereal around with her spoon, not eating. Her shoulders were hunched, her entire body tense like a spring ready to snap. She didn't look up when Mark entered, didn't give her usual shy good morning that he'd grown used to hearing. Liana glanced nervously between her sister and Mark, her own breakfast untouched. The air felt heavy, charged with something Mark couldn't quite understand. "Everything okay?" he asked, reaching for the coffee pot. His voice came out gruffer than he intended, worry making his tone sharp. Layla's spoon clinked against her bowl as her hand trembled. She took a deep breath, then another, like she was gathering all her courage. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are we going somewhere?" The words tumbled out in a rush. "Back to foster care?" Mark's blood ran cold. The coffee pot slipped in his grip, clattering against the counter. How did she know? Had she overheard something? "What makes you think that?" he asked carefully, turning to face them. Layla's eyes were red-rimmed like she hadn't slept. "I heard you on the phone last night, about judges and custody and," her voice cracked, "about not being qualified." Mark's heart squeezed painfully in his chest. Of course, she'd heard his conversation with Lisa and jumped to the worst conclusion, just like he would have at her age. Liana reached for her sister's hand under the table, their fingers intertwining in a gesture they'd probably performed thousands of times before when their world was falling apart. "Who are you to us, Officer Mark?" Layla's whisper was so soft he almost missed it. But there was something else in her voice, a desperate hope she was trying to hide, a question she was afraid to ask directly. Mark set down his coffee cup with trembling hands. This wasn't how he'd planned to tell them. He'd wanted to do it right. Maybe take them somewhere special. Make it a moment they'd remember fondly. But looking at Layla's face, seeing the fear and hurt there, he knew he couldn't wait another second. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and knelt beside their chairs. His knees protested against the hard tile, but he barely noticed. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure they could hear it. "I'm not sending you anywhere," he said first, needing them to understand that. "The custody papers, the judge, that's all because—" He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "Because I'm your dad." The words hung in the air between them. Liana's fork clattered to her plate. Layla's eyes went wide, her mouth forming a small O of surprise. "What?" Layla breathed, her voice shaking. "I'm your father," Mark repeated, stronger this time. "I just found out a few days ago. Your mother, she never told me about you. But the DNA test confirmed it. That's what all the legal stuff is about. I'm trying to make sure you can stay with me permanently." Tears welled up in Layla's eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. Her lower lip trembled as she stared at him, really looked at him, maybe seeing for the first time the features they shared, the same determined set of their jaw, the same protective instinct that made them both put others first. "You're our dad?" Liana whispered, her voice full of wonder. "Our real dad?" Mark nodded, his own vision blurring with tears he couldn't hold back anymore. "Your real dad," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. The kitchen fell silent for a heartbeat before Layla's chair scraped against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone flinch. Her face had transformed from shock to something harder, more wounded. "You're lying!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Her small hands balled into fists at her sides, trembling with emotion. "You're just like everyone else. You only took us in because you had to." Mark reached for her, his heart breaking at the sight of her pain. "Layla, sweetheart, that's not—" "Don't!" She jerked away from his touch, tears streaming down her face. "Don't pretend you care. You didn't want us before, and you don't want us now." Her feet pounded against the floor as she ran from the kitchen, each step like a hammer blow to Mark's chest. The sound of her bedroom door slamming echoed through the house, leaving behind a deafening silence. Mark stood frozen, his hand still outstretched where Layla had pulled away. The rejection stung worse than any injury he'd ever received on duty. He'd known this wouldn't be easy, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw pain in Layla's eyes. A small movement caught his attention. Liana still sat at the table, her eyes wide and watery. Unlike her sister, there was no anger in her expression, only hope and uncertainty. "Are you really our daddy?" she whispered, her voice small and fragile, like she was afraid speaking too loudly might break the spell. Mark's throat tightened as he knelt beside her chair again. "Yes, baby," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'm so sorry I didn't know sooner. If I had known about you girls—" He had to stop, overcome by the weight of all the years he'd missed. Liana slid off her chair and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. Mark held her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo, feeling her small body shake with quiet sobs. "I always wanted a daddy," she whispered against his neck. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I'm here now," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Throughout the day, Layla remained in her room. Every time Mark passed by her door, his footsteps slowing, he could hear small sniffles or angry muttering. Each sound was like a knife to his heart. He tried knocking once, speaking softly through the door. "Layla? Can we talk?" "Go away," came the muffled response, followed by what sounded like a pillow hitting the door. Even at dinner time, she refused to come out. Liana brought her a plate, but returned saying Layla wouldn't take it. "She's really sad," Liana explained, climbing onto the couch beside Mark. "She thinks you only told us because you had to." Mark ran a tired hand over his face. "That's not true at all. I told you because I want you both so much it hurts." "I know," Liana said, snuggling against his side. "Layla's just scared. She doesn't want to believe you in case you change your mind." Mark wrapped an arm around Liana, marveling at how perceptive she was. The trust she showed him made his chest ache even more for Layla's absence. That night, as Mark did his usual check before bed, he paused outside Layla's door. The house felt wrong without her voice, without her careful observations and protective presence. He pressed his palm against the wood, wishing he could reach through and make her understand. "Good night, Layla," he said softly, not expecting a response. He didn't get one. Standing there in the darkened hallway, Mark felt like he was losing her, losing the tentative trust they'd built, losing the chance to be the father she deserved. The weight of it pressed down on his shoulders, making it hard to breathe. He'd faced down armed suspects without flinching, but this, the silence from his daughter, the fear that she might never accept him, this terrified him more than anything he'd ever encountered. The morning sun had barely risen when Mark went to check on the girls. His heart stopped when he found Layla's bed empty, the covers thrown back hastily. A quick search of the house confirmed his worst fear. She was gone. "Liana?" He rushed to wake her sister. "Where's Layla? Did she say anything to you?" Liana rubbed her eyes sleepily. "She was crying last night. She said she needed to check something." Mark's police training kicked in, but it warred with his parental panic. His hands shook as he called Lisa, asking her to watch Liana while he searched. Every worst-case scenario played through his mind as he drove through the quiet streets, scanning sidewalks and parks. Then it hit him. The diner. Their birthday. The one place where they'd first felt safe with him. His tires screeched as he pulled into the parking lot. There she was, a small figure huddled on the steps of the closed diner, her arms wrapped around her knees. The sight of her made his chest ache. Mark approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. The morning air was crisp, and Layla shivered in her thin pajamas. Without a word, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. He sat down beside her on the cold concrete steps, close enough to catch her if she ran, but far enough to give her space. Neither spoke. The only sound was the occasional passing car and Layla's shaky breathing. Minutes stretched by. Mark waited, his heart pounding. He'd faced down armed suspects, worked homicide cases, but nothing had ever terrified him like the thought of losing this little girl. Finally, Layla moved. Her small hand disappeared into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. The edges were worn, like it had been folded and unfolded countless times. She smoothed it against her knee, her fingers trembling. "I found this," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "In the empty apartment. It was under the sink." Mark took the paper carefully. The handwriting was messy, rushed, just one line. "I couldn't do it. I hope someone else can." His jaw clenched as he read the words. So few words to abandon two precious children. He looked at Layla, seeing the pain etched across her young face. "I don't think she ever loved us," Layla said, her voice breaking. The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "She just left us, like we were nothing." Mark's heart shattered. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he gently wiped her tears with his thumb. "Then let me love you instead," he said softly, his own voice thick with emotion. Layla's breath hitched. She looked up at him, really looked at him, for the first time since learning the truth. Her eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of deception. "You didn't know about us," she whispered. "You didn't choose us." "No, I didn't know," Mark admitted. "But I'm choosing you now, both of you, and I'll keep choosing you every single day for the rest of my life." Layla's lower lip trembled. "What if you change your mind?" "Never." Mark's voice was firm, certain. "You're my daughter, Layla. You and Liana. You're not just some kids I found on the school steps anymore. You're my girls. My family." A sob escaped Layla's throat. She launched herself into Mark's arms, burying her face against his chest. Her small body shook as years of pain and fear poured out. Mark held her close, one hand cradling the back of her head. His own tears fell into her hair as he rocked her gently. "I've got you," he whispered. "I've got you, and I'm never letting go." The walk home was quiet, the early morning streets still mostly empty. Mark kept glancing at Layla, who walked beside him with small, measured steps. Her hand occasionally brushed against his, but she didn't quite take it. She was still wearing his jacket, which hung nearly to her knees. Every few blocks, Mark would check his phone, reassuring himself that Lisa's texts confirmed Liana was still safe and sound at home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as they walked, and Mark noticed how Layla's shoulders seemed less tense than before. When they reached the house, Liana burst through the front door, nearly knocking Layla over with her fierce hug. "Don't ever do that again," she cried, her voice muffled against her sister's shoulder. "You scared me." Layla hugged her back just as tightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I won't." Lisa gave Mark a knowing look before leaving, squeezing his arm as she passed. The rest of the day passed in a gentle quiet, with the girls staying close to each other. Mark noticed how Layla's eyes followed him around the house, watching his every move as if trying to solve a puzzle. He kept things simple, making grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch and letting them watch cartoons on the couch. He didn't push or prod, giving Layla the space to process everything. Sometimes he caught her staring at him with an expression that made his heart ache, like she was trying to memorize his face in case he disappeared. As evening fell, Mark went through their usual bedtime routine. He helped Liana brush her teeth, checked under the bed for monsters, even though they all knew there weren't any, and made sure both girls had enough blankets. But tonight felt different. The air was charged with unspoken words and shifting emotions. After tucking Liana in, Mark headed to his room, leaving the hall light on as always. He was just about to close his door when he saw Layla standing in the doorway, her small frame casting a long shadow in the hallway light. She wore the oversized t-shirt he'd given her as a nightgown, her feet bare against the wooden floor. Her fingers twisted in the hem of her shirt, a nervous habit he'd noticed over the past weeks. She looked so young and vulnerable standing there, nothing like the fierce protector she usually was for her sister. "Can't sleep?" Mark asked softly, keeping his voice gentle. Layla shook her head, taking a small step forward. Her eyes met his for a moment, before dropping to the floor. The silence stretched between them, but Mark waited patiently. He'd learned that with Layla, sometimes silence said more than words. Finally, she lifted her head. In the dim light, he could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear of hoping too much. "If we stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You won't leave, right?" Mark's heart clenched. He moved slowly, kneeling down beside her so they were at eye level. Up close, he could see the trembling in her lower lip, the way she was trying so hard to be brave. "Not even if the world ended," he said firmly, meaning every word. "You and Liana are stuck with me now, kiddo. That's a promise." Something in Layla's expression cracked then, like a wall finally crumbling. Without warning, she threw her arms around his neck, hugging him for the first time since he'd found them on those school steps. Her small body shook with silent tears as she pressed her face into his shoulder. Mark held her close, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other rubbed soothing circles on her back. He could feel her heart racing against his chest, could feel the way she clung to him like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "I've got you," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you, sweetheart. Always." The morning sun filtered through the windows of Mark's house, casting warm patches of light across the hardwood floors. It had been 3 days since Layla's tearful acceptance, and something had shifted in their little family. The air felt lighter, filled with possibilities instead of uncertainty. At breakfast that morning, Liana accidentally let it slip first. She was reaching for the syrup, her pajama sleeve nearly dipping into her pancakes. "Dad, can you pass that?" The word hung in the air for a moment before she realized what she'd said. Her eyes went wide and she quickly looked down at her plate. Mark's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his movements casual as he handed her the syrup. He didn't want to make a big deal of it, afraid to break the delicate new trust they were building. Later that afternoon, Mark led the girls up the stairs, his hands covering their eyes. He'd spent the past few days secretly working with Lisa to transform the spare rooms while the girls were at school. The walls were freshly painted, soft purple for Layla, mint green for Liana. Real beds replaced the temporary mattresses, dressed with colorful comforters the girls had pointed out at the store weeks ago. "Ready?" Mark asked, his voice thick with emotion. 1, 2, 3. He removed his hands and the girl's gasps filled the air. Liana immediately ran to her room, squealing at the butterfly decals on the walls and the small reading nook in the corner with a basket full of books. She bounced on the bed, her eyes shining with joy. But it was Layla's reaction that caught in Mark's throat. She stood frozen in her doorway, staring at the desk by the window, the cork board for her drawings, the string lights that created a soft glow around the room. Her fingers traced the edge of the purple comforter, as if checking to make sure it was real. "We've never had a real home," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. She turned to look at Mark, her eyes full of wonder and disbelief. That evening, as Mark tucked them into their new beds for the first time, Layla's voice was soft but clear. "Good night, Dad." The word came out tentatively, like she was testing how it felt on her tongue. Mark had to turn away quickly, using the excuse of adjusting her nightlight to wipe his eyes before they could see. In the quiet of the hallway, Mark listened to the sounds of his daughters settling into their new rooms, the rustle of blankets, Liana's contented sighs, Layla's quiet humming. The word "Dad" echoed in his mind, filling spaces he hadn't even known were empty. He found himself standing in the doorway of Layla's room long after she'd fallen asleep, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. The string lights cast a soft glow over her peaceful face, and for the first time she looked truly at rest. On her desk lay the crumpled note from her mother, but it seemed less important now, overshadowed by the artwork Layla had already pinned to her corkboard, including a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands labeled "Our Family." Mark sat in his parked car, staring at the rundown apartment complex where Tamara had last been seen. The brick walls were weathered, paint peeling off in tired strips, and dead plants hung from rusty balcony railings. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he gathered his courage. He needed to do this, not just for himself, but for Layla and Liana. They deserved to know their whole story, even the painful parts. As he climbed the creaky stairs to the 3rd floor, an elderly woman emerged from apartment 3C, curious eyes peering at him through thick glasses. "Can I help you?" she asked, adjusting her shawl. Mark cleared his throat. "I'm looking for information about Tamara Johnson. She used to live here." The woman's expression softened with recognition. "Oh, that poor dear. She left months ago." She paused, studying Mark's face. "You must be him, the father she talked about." Mark's heart skipped a beat. She knew about me? The neighbor disappeared into her apartment for a moment, returning with a wrinkled envelope. "She left this. Said someone might come looking one day." With trembling hands, Mark accepted the envelope. His name wasn't on it, but somehow he knew it was meant for him. The paper was cheap and thin, worn at the edges as if it had been handled many times before being sealed. He carefully opened it, unfolding the single sheet inside. Tamara's handwriting was shaky but legible. "I wasn't strong enough, but if you're reading this, maybe they found someone who is." Mark's vision blurred as he read those words over and over. His chest felt tight, a mix of anger and sadness washing over him. He thought of Layla and Liana waiting for their mother on those cold school steps, of their brave faces hiding so much pain. The neighbor watched him quietly. She loved them, in her own way, but sometimes love isn't enough when you're fighting your own demons. Mark clutched the letter, the paper crinkling in his grip. He felt both heartbroken for what his daughters had endured and grateful that fate had brought them to him. The weight of Tamara's words settled in his chest, not just her confession of weakness, but her hope that someone stronger would be there for her children. "Thank you," he managed to say to the neighbor, his voice rough with emotion, "for keeping this safe." The elderly woman nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Those girls deserve happiness. I hope they found it." The courthouse was quiet and imposing, with its high ceilings and dark wood panels. Mark stood before the judge's bench, his heart pounding beneath his crisp blue shirt. Layla and Liana sat in the front row, their matching dresses smooth and neat, their hands clasped tightly together. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the adoption papers spread across the judge's desk. Mark's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the pen, its weight suddenly feeling much heavier than it should. Layla watched him intently, her eyes carrying that familiar guardedness, the look of someone who'd learned not to hope too much. Beside her, Liana bounced nervously in her seat, her small fingers squeezing her sister's hand. The judge, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Mark. "Mr. Reynolds, do you accept responsibility for these children?" Mark turned away from the papers, facing his daughters. His gaze met Layla's first, those eyes so much like his own, carrying a wisdom far beyond her years. Then Liana's hopeful face, her trust already given so freely. His voice came out clear and strong, filled with certainty he'd never known before. "They're my daughters." The words hung in the air, simple but powerful. Layla's lower lip trembled, and then, like a dam breaking, tears began rolling down her cheeks. She didn't try to hide them or wipe them away. These weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of finally believing, of finally letting go of the doubt she'd carried for so long. Liana beamed through her own tears, but Layla's reaction was different. This was the first time she'd allowed herself to truly believe that someone, that her father, wanted them, chose them, loved them. The autumn breeze rustled through the backyard as Mark leaned against the porch railing, watching his daughters play. The once empty yard now had a small swing set, and colorful chalk drawings decorated the concrete path. Layla was pushing Liana on the swing, their giggles floating through the air like music. Mark's house had transformed over the past few months. Where bare walls once stood, crayon drawings and family photos now hung proudly. The sterile silence had been replaced by the constant patter of little feet and bursts of laughter. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table eating spaghetti, the girls' favorite, Mark noticed them exchanging secretive looks. Layla kept fidgeting with something under the table, while Liana tried to hide her excited smile behind her glass of milk. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, raising an eyebrow. The girls shared one final glance before Layla pulled out a slightly crumpled homemade card. The front was decorated with glitter and hand-drawn hearts, and in wobbly letters written in different colored markers it read, "Happy Daddy Day." Mark's fork clattered against his plate. His throat tightened as he stared at the card, his vision becoming blurry. "You mean me?" he managed to whisper, his voice rough with emotion. Liana bounced in her seat, her face glowing. "You're our dad now," she declared proudly. Mark carefully took the card, his hands trembling slightly. Inside, both girls had drawn pictures, stick figures of the three of them holding hands, surrounded by hearts and stars. Their signatures were at the bottom, complete with little hearts dotting the eyes. He looked at their eager faces, these two precious girls who had completely changed his life, and felt his heart swell with a love he never knew existed before them. The night settled softly over their home as Mark finished reading the bedtime story. Layla and Liana were tucked snugly in their beds, their room now decorated with twinkling fairy lights and colorful wall decals they had picked out together. Mark closed the storybook and placed it on the small shelf nearby. The shelf itself was a testament to change. Once empty, it now held a growing collection of their favorite stories. "Sweet dreams, my girls," he whispered, his voice gentle in the dim light of their room. As he started to rise, something unexpected happened. Layla, who had always been the more guarded of the two, reached out and grabbed his hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his, holding on with a trust that had taken months to build. Mark's heart swelled as he looked down at her hand in his. This was the same girl who had once flinched at his approach, who had built walls so high he wasn't sure they'd ever come down. Now here she was, holding on to him like he was her anchor. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before slowly letting go. Walking to the door, he reached for the light switch, pausing for a moment to take in the scene. The soft glow of their nightlight cast gentle shadows on their peaceful faces. As he clicked off the main light, Mark felt it deep in his soul. This was the family he never saw coming, but always needed. The house around him, once cold and empty, now pulsed with life and warmth. From somewhere downstairs came the quiet hum of the dishwasher they had loaded together after dinner, and the faint echo of their earlier laughter seemed to linger in the halls. The home that had once been just a place to sleep between shifts had become exactly what it was meant to be. A sanctuary filled with love, trust, and the unmistakable presence of family. If you enjoyed the story of Mark, Layla, and Liana, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.